Hi everyone, thanks so much for coming to our first community health talk. I'm super excited to be here, and I love talking about the science of fat loss using nutrition. I love talking in general about weight management because when people do weight management properly, they actually improve the overall health of their entire body. And the reverse is very true as well. If people work on losing weight but they do it in a very unhealthy way, they actually can create a lot of damage to their body and increase cellular aging as they go along. So my goal is not necessarily just to have people lose weight. I want people to become healthier in the process as well and decrease the risk for chronic disease and ultimately move towards a state of optimal health for you. So what we're going to be doing in this talk today is we're going to break down a number of the primary factors that really play in helping you to manage weight. Now, it could be any one of these or any combination. It could be one of them or many of them. The key is that these different areas that I'm going to talk about really start to become extremely important if you are having troubles trying to get into your optimal weight. So I'm going to briefly go over each one, and then we're going to go through much more detail as we go along. So eat real foods. There's not much more to explain about that, but if you want your body to become healthier in the process of losing weight, you need to eat real nutritious foods. You have to get away from packaged foods. A lot of the healthy diet types of packaged foods just will not do your body any good, and they are not a good solution for long-term weight management. Next, we're going to talk about food intolerances, and I call this the hidden saboteur. And the reason is that sometimes when people are doing everything right, they're eating well, they seem to be exercising, they don't seem to be having a lot of garbage in their diet, but they still get stuck and they cannot lose that extra weight. A lot of times you probably have some kind of a food sensitivity or intolerance. And I'm going to break down the difference between a sensitivity and intolerance shortly. The next one to look at would be managing blood sugar. And people are pretty aware of this, and the glycemic index was a big thing. People have written books about that. I'm going to break down the difference between glycemic index and glycemic load because that's a really important distinction to make. If your blood sugar is out of balance, it makes it very hard for you to stay on track. It can put you in storage mode, it can make your body stressed, it can increase insulin levels, and it also increases cravings, so it's very hard for you to stay the course. Fat's the new skinny. This has been a really interesting topic for me over the last year or so as I've really incorporated a lot more good fats into my diet personally. I have found this to be one of the most important things that I've done that has made a big difference. So this whole idea that fat causes you to be fat and fat's unhealthy, there's a lot more to that argument. And what we're going to talk about is how eating good fats can actually help you burn fat and help your body become fat adapted, meaning that you are now using fats as your primary source of energy, not sugars and proteins. Stress makes you fat. I think a lot of people know that fat that raises, the hormone cortisol, which causes you to retain fat, primarily around that midsection. If you are in a constant state of stress, and now that can be from many factors, something you might not think about, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more detail too, but if you're in a constant state of stress, mental, emotionally, or physically, then it makes it very hard again to minimize your weight. Feed the right bugs. This talks about the gut microbiome. This is a fascinating new area in health science, in not just weight management, but in overall health, in this interaction that our body has with this mass amount of bacteria that we have living inside of us, particularly in our gut. And it is actually a very symbiotic relationship. And if we do not feed the good bacteria and we feed the bad bacteria, they have a very powerful epigenetic role actually shutting down your metabolism or changing how you extract nutrition from food. They're a huge player in maintaining whether you can manage weight or whether you're not going to be able to manage weight. We're going to break down each one of these in more detail as we go along. So the key point I want to get across here is that when it comes to weight management, it is much more than just food and exercise. It is much more than just calories in and calories out. It's all about balancing your chemistry inside your body. A food allergy is an IgE allergy, and that's the one where we get this big wheel and flare, we get hives, it's scary, we think of like asthma attacks and people dying. The problem is that the vast majority of foods do not react in an IgE way. They react from different antibodies, and they're names like IgG, which is a more common one, or an IgA, which is a different one. And they're in different areas of the tissue, and they present differently. An IgG food intolerance reaction is not so immediate when you have it and you swell up. You can react anywhere from 20 minutes to maybe 3 days later before you get the full ramifications of what that food did to you. And this is why so often people be like, I don't know, I had that food one day and it seemed to bug my stomach or give me joint pain, but then I ate it again later and it didn't seem to bother me, so it's probably not that. The thing is, you probably have multiple ones or different levels of food sensitivities, and when you're having too many at the same time, it pushes you over your threshold. If you've gotten away with just having one or having enough space between them, it might not be enough to give you symptoms. So they're tricky ones to narrow down. All of these and more are all possible symptoms of food sensitivities. So just kind of skim over the list. You think of digestion. So if people have generally gas, bloating, indigestion, constipation, diarrhea, stomach pains, anything along those lines when you eat certain foods, probably have a bit of an intolerance or sensitivity reaction to something that you're having. Sleep. So people can have chronic fatigue, and I don't even mean like a full-on syndrome of chronic fatigue, but just tired all the time. They can have ups and downs with their energy. They can have insomnia. You can have chronic sinus issues and nasal congestion. That's a huge one for certain food sensitivities. Chronic muscle aches and pains. When I see people that come in to see me more for osteopathy, for like sprain injuries or chronic knee problems or back problems, I always think that one of the important things too is tighten up the whole diet stuff first, because food intolerances will create inflammation. And when you get inflammation, that is a stepping stone in the direction of just about everything else going wrong. Inflammation is the cornerstone of almost all disease. And food sensitivities and intolerances are one of the things that can really trigger a lot of that in people. Skin rashes. So we'll see this in kids all the time. If I see a child and they tend to have a lot of cradle cap and maybe eczema, where they start to get quite a bit of eczema on the skin. If that's not addressed at that point, not uncommon that they probably will get reflux and heartburn types of issues and digestive problems. But then it's not uncommon that then that usually turns into ear infections. And then if you don't treat that down the road, then that turns into asthma. And then it turns into more chronic allergies. So these are sort of sequelae to some things if they're not sort of addressed early on. Mood. Believe it or not, food sensitivities can play havoc with your mood. Same as how blood sugar can. If you're eating the wrong foods, you can find that certain foods will dump your serotonin levels, which is your natural antidepressant type of neurotransmitter. You can create adrenalized reactions where you eat the wrong food and it actually makes you sort of adrenalized and sort of amps you up and puts you into like a fight or flight mode. Energy ups and downs, unsteady energy, weight gain, primarily because it creates a lot of inflammation, which you will learn basically sets the stage for screwing up your insulin levels, your cortisol levels, and all these other hormones that govern our ability to manage weight. And on top of it, we'll usually get premature aging. So what do they do? When you have a food that your body does not agree with very well, or you have antibodies that are tagged for it. So, for example, you can either be born with certain food intolerances, or through a diet that has been really a poor kind of Western American diet, or you can have had a history of a lot of antibiotic use, or you could be chronically stressed. There's a whole slew of different reasons as to why you might set the stage up for developing food sensitivities. The goal is not necessarily to then be off of every food that you're intolerant to. Trust me, I grew up having horrible allergies. I kind of got into this field because I had chronic sinus issues. I could not breathe at all through here, and I broke my nose, thanks to my older brother. But I had chronic sinus issues, I had chronic asthma. I was the kid that was taken by hospital every once in a while, or taken by ambulance into the hospital to sit in an oxygen tent for a while because of asthma. So it wasn't until I was in my mid-20s when I actually found all of these types of food allergies. And I had a lot of the other IgE ones too. But once I narrowed these down, that's what really changed a lot of stuff in my health, because now I was managing what's coming into my body on a regular basis. And once you heal up the gut, then you can usually tolerate things a little bit more. So when you get this, you get gut inflammation. When you get gut inflammation, that triggers a cascade of different things that happen that make it hard to manage weight. You get chemical changes. So cortisol levels, which is our natural stress hormone, deals with inflammation. So cortisol levels go up to try and manage inflammation. But cortisol does other things too. It also raises blood sugar, which is not a good thing on a regular basis. If we're chronically inflamed and we're always raising cortisol level, we're always raising blood sugar. And cortisol also has a way of sort of decreasing serotonin, which makes us feel good, right? And actually helps us prevent cravings. It also messes up our leptin. Has anybody ever heard of this hormone leptin? It was a big one in weight management a while back when it came up. Leptin is the primary hormone that is our satiety hormone. So we want leptin to come up and we want to be sensitive to it. So if I eat a meal, my leptin levels should come up, I should react to that, and then they'll come back down. So leptin tells me, you're full, stop eating. What people can get when they've got gut inflammation is you stop responding to this. So you're not catching the signal that's telling you that you're full. Stop eating, okay? We actually don't hear it, and then we just keep on eating. You actually develop what's called a leptin resistance. No different than when we hear diabetics that have an insulin resistance. They're very paired hormones. They often go together. So over time of having inflammation, raising cortisol, raising blood sugar, raising our insulin levels to try and deal with the blood sugar, over time we start to find that our body is not as responsive anymore. It'd be like someone tapping you on the shoulder over and over and over again, and initially you're kind of responsive, like what's going on, what's going on? And after a while you just turn your back and you carry on with what you're doing while they're still tapping because they've been doing it for so long. Insulin and ghrelin. So insulin levels also, over time, inflammation triggers insulin. And insulin also triggers inflammation. So when we are having higher levels of insulin, we also create more inflammation. Ghrelin is our hormone that, so leptin tells us when we're full, ghrelin tells us that we're hungry. It tells us to eat more, okay? And so these ones also get out of balance so that we don't have a signal telling us to, we're having a signal telling us to eat more and more, and we don't have a signal that we're listening to that's telling us that we're full. So we kind of get in this vicious cycle of food cravings and eat. When insulin goes up, insulin also has a tendency to retain more sodium. So then we start to get a lot more swelling and inflammation. And this is where we get fluid retention. And so it's like, have you ever had a meal at night and then woken up in the morning and looked in the mirror and you just feel like you have a layer of fluid under your skin and you just feel like you're not as toned as you would feel on other days? And people think, oh my gosh, I'm getting fat. Most of the time it's not fat. The vast majority of what people are dealing with is usually inflammation and a lot of water retention. And when you balance this stuff out, a lot of it is no longer there. And you get up and you put your clothes on in the morning and you look in the mirror and things feel just leaner. You fit into your clothes nicer. And everybody's had those days where it feels better in the morning and days when it doesn't. Okay, and most of it has to do with what information did you give your body through the foods that you ate the night before. Digestive problems. Food intolerance, because of this leaky gut irritation, start to mess up your ability to digest foods. They disrupt the natural bacterial flora in our gut, which is very important. And you can actually have absorption issues and not get all the nutrition you need. And all of these things eventually create low energy, which then makes it really hard for you to show up and do exercise and do different things to try and manage everything properly anyways. So if you want to break inflammation, what I generally would do is avoid the top 7 food intolerances for a period of time. I'll tell you what those things are in just a bit. Very important. This is why when Tay and I do like a spring detox, we often take a lot of these things out, because I think the vast benefit of doing a detox is more the foods you're taking out rather than the key things you're doing to put in. Detox is not about the supplements to support the liver and everything. That is the secondary part that supports the real work you do by managing diet. It's like if you're trying to put out a big forest fire, but in the meantime, you're lighting fires everywhere you go. It's really hard to try and manage the big fire. So you have to kind of take a lot of them out. Do you have to take out all of them? Depends on the person. But how I've heard it described is like, imagine if you're sitting on a stool with 7 tacks on it. Say you take 5 of the tacks out, but there's still 2 tacks. It still hurts when you sit down. So you might want to take them all out initially, see what the benefit is, and then you sort of see which ones are worse. What can you get away with? Some people might find, okay, I bring dairy back in and dairy seems to not bug me that much. And other people kind of notice, yep, that one really doesn't do me very good. Eat real foods without the additives, preservatives, and don't eat GMOs. For the most part, these have been shown to create gut inflammation. Okay? Remove bad oils and eat healthy oils. The primary food in our body that governs inflammatory cycles and non-inflammatory cycles are our fats. This is why we do things like omega-3s. And you have to have a specific ratio between omega-3s, omega-6s, and inflammatory fats called arachidonic acid. And if they're out of balance, you will create inflammatory hormones. Okay? If they're in balance, you are creating anti-inflammatory hormones. And you need a proper balance of both. Heal the gut lining and optimize bacterial flora, which I'll talk about in a little bit because I think that's a fascinating one. So top 7 allergens. You might see some discrepancies with these, but across the board, I would say these are probably your biggest ones. My least favorite one to take out with this is probably eggs, because I think eggs have so much benefit to them, as I think they really are a fairly perfect food. And I still eat eggs fairly regularly, but I might switch them around and see. Ultimately, once you get into a good zone, and you know what good feels like, because a lot of times if you have been out of it for too long, you've got no idea what it actually feels like. Until people have actually done this and gone long enough, you really don't have an idea of what you can actually feel like. When I first did this, because I was on a super strict diet when I first did it for all of my allergies, and I was on that for probably between 6 to 8 months, and I was strict, like I didn't budge. And it was a complete game changer. It's like my entire immune system switched gears over that year. And then the following year, my allergies were probably 20% of what they used to be, and then after that, they were literally gone. Because these things don't just, when inflammation gets affected, you gotta think of the body as just one huge interactive cycle. And when you interfere with one area, you will create problems in another. When inflammation comes up, it starts to create, it's our immune system that governs a lot of this stuff. And foods are a big way that we trigger things like autoimmunity too, and create different conditions from that. So, how many people have tried to remove at least some of these things before? Has anybody taken them all out at the same time?
No.
Good. How was it when you tried?
For a week, and then the sugar one in particular.
Yeah. Everybody's got their weak spot, you know, whether it's sugar or cheese, like old cheddar cheese, or whether it's a bagel or something along those lines. And my general idea is do what works, but first find out what optimal feels like. Because otherwise I feel like we're cheating ourselves because we really don't know. So my thoughts, do this type of stuff for a while, and really you have to do that for at least a month to really get the full benefits of it. And ask yourself this, when you're looking at different foods, if you get a bit of a shudder when you get to one of them, that tells you that your body is very addicted to that food. And you've actually probably got different bacteria in your gut that are creating, that you're feeding into a cycle that can be preventing weight management too.
Jay, can I ask you something? So like I grew up and I wasn't allergic to any of that. Now,
Yeah.
being older, of course I find, with the breads today, like I'm more bloated. But I didn't know about peanuts.
For different reasons, peanuts have a tendency to create one of the most lethal mold toxins around called aflatoxin. And so peanuts in general create molds, and a lot of people are very sensitive to molds. Now, within that, you will find some people that aren't nearly as sensitive as other people, right? A lot of things create molds. Wines create molds, coffees create molds, peanuts create molds, and mold. Yeah, like a fungus.
Coffee?
So depending on the processing of them, depends on sort of how much mold and then the toxins from those molds actually we get, right? So peanuts in general, also peanuts are a big IgE allergy too. They're probably one of the scariest ones that's your true allergic response.
What about nuts in general?
In general, not for your top 7 allergens. Yeah, but also different people can have weird ones here or there too. Like if you run a food allergy test for it, you will get a breakdown of probably about 120 foods and give you a better picture of where you are. It's always not 100%, but it gives you a better, clearer picture of kind of what you might be more susceptible to and what might not be quite a big deal.
So I noticed you allowed fruit is allowed.
Well, fruit is not usually an allergen. Now, for other reasons, we might be careful with fruit as we go along. Okay, blood sugar balance. So, blood sugar for the most part, this is where you get your spikes and crashes in blood sugar. Every time this happens, we increase cortisol. So if we're riding along like this for blood sugar, and after about 2 to 3 hours for a lot of people, they start to dip down like this. If they go too far, there's 2 things are going to happen. they're either going to get major cravings for something to try and raise it back up, or if they don't eat and they're not able to, their body is going to raise cortisol levels to bring your blood sugar back up. So along with that, you usually get too much of a spike, which then increases insulin. Too much insulin is a big storage hormone that kind of pulls everything in and sort of says, shuts everything down and says, okay, we're storing now. We're not going to burn anything, we're storing fat. So getting into these ups and downs, blood sugar spikes, not to mention that it's stressful on your body. When you're raising cortisol all the time, that's a stressful aging hormone on your body to have going on. And Lord knows, most people have more than enough cortisol on a regular basis outside of food, just from living a North American sort of style lifestyle. Mental, emotional stresses, all these other things play into it. Can make you moody and irritable and lightheaded. So, I mean, has anybody ever had like hypoglycemic, where their blood sugar drops out and feel kind of like trembly, headachy, irritable, moody? That's pretty classic symptoms of it. But hypoglycemia is also a risk factor for diabetes. If you're dropping too much all the time, it means you're not regulating your blood sugar very effectively. And when that happens, it often makes it almost impossible to avoid eating the foods that you know you probably shouldn't eat when our blood sugar crashes and we get strong cravings. It's such a physiological necessity. It's like this system to this sort of food cycle blood sugar system is a rudimentary system that governs survival. So it's like it sort of takes precedent almost over everything, because we're still wired the same way as if we were back in the day in hunter-gatherers and we were being chased by a bear or something like that, that we go into fight or flight. If we were in starvation mode for a bit, we would go into fight or flight for a bit. There's certain things that we have to do that our body goes into because it's based on a long history of how the system works. So you want to kind of be like this for the most part, okay? When we start to do this, too high ups and downs, we get cravings and we spike up. We get insulin pulls up and then we get pulled back down. Then we start to need these types of foods to try and get our stuff back up again. And so you'll see a lot of times people can go through their entire day on this up and down roller coaster. I think, and I'll talk about this in a bit, but one of the best ways to change this cycle is to train your body to become fat adapted. Meaning train your body to use fat as its primary fuel source as opposed to using sugars and proteins. Because we really have two different systems that burn calories. So we can either do sugars and proteins, which essentially get broken down into glucose, or we have fats that get broken down into ketones. When we learn to use ketones, which is actually what we were designed to live with. Because you think about it, back in the day we didn't have a convenience store that we could pop by and get food 24/7 whenever we wanted to. We'd have to gather it or we'd have to hunt for it. So we were used to going through periods of not eating where we had to rely on burning fat for fuel. But we've kind of lost that, and most people do not burn fat very effectively, and they're stuck more in burning sugar because they eat carbohydrates and proteins kind of too often all day long. And there's a difference between blood sugar when I'm looking at glycemic index versus glycemic load. So, has everybody heard of glycemic index before? This is telling us how fast a food basically turns into sugar, okay? And basically, these are sort of in your high zone, your medium, and your low is anywhere kind of like, 55 down. Glycemic load is when you look at the glycemic index of a food plus the quantity of carbohydrates that you're having from that food, okay? And so this is important because a lot of times glycemic load plays way more importance than glycemic index does. So for example, say I'm going to eat a single carrot. A carrot actually has a high glycemic index of about 131, but it only contains about 4 grams of carbs. So when you calculate it, where you would do 1.31, you would go 1.31, okay, the glycemic index, times the amount of carbs, and you end up with 5. That's a very good glycemic load. That's not going to bug you over the long haul. 70% dark chocolate, glycemic index of about 23. really low glycemic index. So say you eat 31 grams of it, which would be a small bar. Your glycemic load is just over 7. Still not that bad. Try a mashed potato. Glycemic is of 104, but it contains about 37 grams, and most people would eat a whole potato. Your glycemic load ends up being over 38. So when you look in the big picture of it, what's actually going to be better for you in the long run? Now, I'm not saying everybody should be eating bars and bars of dark chocolate, but you probably would be better off to do that than to have a big mashed potato. So this is what I always come back to with patients. The best way for you to know if you are hormonally balanced and if you ate a meal that works for your body. I use the acronym CHEW. So what you chew affects you. After you have eaten a meal, you should find that you do not have food cravings. You should find that you are not hungry for several hours after. You should find that your energy does not go up and down and crash. And you should find that your weight is managed fairly easily. If you are eating hormonally balanced, all of those things are balanced. Okay? And for the most part, those correlate very well with optimal leptin levels, which is your satiety hormone. When we actually measure that, you sometimes can measure a fasting leptin and a fasting insulin. Those are very good markers for longevity, actually. So when you eat a meal, and this is why I think doing a food diary is so valuable. If you do a food diary and at the end of the day, you track this kind of stuff, or after meals, you kind of go, okay, I had breakfast and oh my gosh, I was starving and I was craving a donut by this time, or I needed to have my coffee for this. That's information. It's like jot it down and then look at what you had and then try a different routine. So say you had like breakfast cereal in the morning. See how you felt. You might be somebody that manages breakfast cereal, right? Doesn't seem to bug you. But is it managing your weight? So you have to look at all the different factors. If that gave you, say, ups and downs and crashes in blood sugar and you were starving within, an hour and a half after, maybe the next time try something like a couple of eggs and avocado. Try something like that. Or try maybe a protein shake with more good fats in it or something along those lines and just see what's ultimately going to work for your body best. Because not everybody is the same, and there is really no one diet that's best for everybody. There's a template that I kind of start with, and then we play with it and tweak it depending on how people feel.
You don't think that like the GI and the load factor that you were talking about, is there like an optimal place to be for a meal?
For your glycemic load, yeah.
Like
You want your meals to be under 20. Optimally, that's what you're looking for. Well, or have some of the baked potato and have it with other ones that are down on this side, right? So you have it with lots of vegetables, you have it with good fats. All of those are extremely low glycemic index. And there's still some times where I would just have a baked potato because I like a baked potato once in a while. You don't have to be super regiment, but you have to do what works. And so, like, when I was originally doing stuff more for health, not for weight management, but the idea is the same thing. When I was originally doing that, I was super strict because I needed to be super strict. Because if I went off, my symptoms would come back. I needed to spend enough time to get my body changed around, to heal up the gut, to get my hormones back on track. And some of that just takes a little bit of time to do it. Okay, fat's the new skinny. So why I say this is because there's definitely a large movement that's come up over the last year or so where they've debunked a lot of the information around cholesterol and saturated fat, and it's killing everybody. They've really sort of done a 180 on that, and what they do realize now is that for the most part, it was never really the beneficial saturated fats, the cholesterol. It was really the refined vegetable oils and the sugars. Those are the things that skyrocketed and increased cardiovascular risk for the most part. So when we do this, we talk about becoming fat adapted. Becoming fat adapted means you train your body to burn fat as its primary source of fuel again, like we were genetically designed to do back in the original day. We were supposed to use fat as our long-term fuel. So we want to practice doing that, and for the most part, that's following the type of diet that I'm going to talk about towards the end a little bit. And a lot of times they would even say, initially, you need to start to taper the amount of your carbohydrates so that your body starts to get used to using fats as a fuel source. As it gets more proficient at burning fats, it now starts to get more proficient at burning your own fat. Healthy fats stabilize blood sugar. So if you incorporate fats, the very low glycemic index, they slow the release of glucose and you don't get these ups and down spikes. Healthy fats, like we talked about, govern inflammation. So when you're eating the right kinds of fats, you are creating anti-inflammatory environment. When you're having the wrong kinds of fats, you're creating an inflammatory environment. Okay? So inflammatory environment would be fats like almost all of our vegetable types of oils. Okay? So other than a couple things, but soy oil, canola oil, sunflower oil, pretty much all of your nut oils most of the time. And the problem is because the process of them usually requires high heats, which damages oils. Fats are extremely sensitive to light, heat, and oxygen. So what happens is they oxidize, which means they become free radicals. So has anybody heard of antioxidants? We take antioxidants to quench free radicals. But if we're eating a bunch of bad vegetable oils that turn into free radicals as soon as they get, usually in the bottle by the time you get it, they're already rancid most of the time. So you don't actually get much benefit from them. Even things like flax oil. Flaxseed, that's a good thing. Grind up flaxseed, get all the benefits from it. Don't use flax oil. Flax oil is turned into a rancid fat very easily. Burning fats turn on pathways that make you superhuman. And this is very true. It's like in the original days of hunter-gatherer kind of living, we were meant to go through periods of fasting. We were designed where there was just times where food wasn't available. And so when food wasn't available, our body turns on these ancient old mechanisms that literally help us survive until we can get through the famine so that then we can procreate again. So when we start to have, and one of the triggers for that is ketones. And ketones are what happens when we burn fats. So if we train our bodies to become more efficient at burning fats, we start to burn ketones. That's a message for our body to turn on a lot of these pathways that actually decrease inflammation. They increase detoxification. They decrease free radical stress. We have all these mechanisms inherent within our body that get turned on when we eat the right kinds of foods. And they get turned off when we eat the wrong kinds of foods. And so low leptin levels, which is kind of this master hormone, improves every biomarker for longevity. Their bodies literally start to de-age. And you will see this in people that leptin levels are up here that eventually go down to here. They start to look like they're 10 years younger. You lower your blood sugar, you lower your body temperature, key hormones restore to youthful levels. You even actually start to lower your body temperature because you run at such an efficient level that your thyroid doesn't have to rev up so hard anymore. So fats and leptins, so epigenetics. This is the impact that diet and lifestyle have on regulating how our genes express. Okay? And our genes are always expressing health or disease depending on what we're asking them to do. So what they found is that when you would calorie restrict a diet by about a third, you could double the lifespan of animals. Double it by decreasing their calories by a third. The only problem is that if we tried to decrease our calories by a third for the vast majority of the time, we'd probably all be a bunch of jerks because it's irritating, we'd be moody, we probably would be hungry all the time. So that doesn't work so well. Now I do think in general we don't need to eat as much as we think we do, but you bypass that when you lower your leptin levels. That's the trigger for it. When you decrease your calories, often you're lowering leptin. So if you lower leptin levels by eating a diet like I'm sort of suggesting, which would be incorporating more good fats, more fiber from vegetable sources, a lower sort of carbohydrate and refined carb type of a diet, you will end up managing leptin levels and turning on a lot of these other pathways. So good fats do a few things. They don't stimulate a surge in leptin, they actually suppress it. So they help you keep in a lower leptin level. You don't need as much of it to feel satiety, and you won't get leptin resistance. Fat is burned as fat. It's not burned as sugar. It's a different system. And you actually get a lot more energy when you burn fat as opposed to burning sugar. And when you are incorporating good fats, you in turn start to stimulate your body to burn more good fats. Think about it this way too. We think fat makes us fat, but what do you feed cattle to make them bulk up? No, you don't feed them grass. You feed them corn and you feed them grains. So you feed them a ton of grains if you want to marble the fat and make them really obese. So it's like we're not giving them fat, we're giving them grains. And it's the grains that actually turn into saturated fat. So when we eat a lot of carbohydrates, we're going to see our cholesterol and we're going to see our saturated fats increase most of the time. If you are burning sugar 24/7, if your body is in a cycle of you're eating a lot of carbohydrates regularly all the time, you will eventually make it very difficult to tap into burning fat. And not only that, you create downstream problems. Because if you become very effective at burning sugar, your body doesn't even want to go to burning fat. It'll actually go to burning protein first because that turns into sugar. So once you run out of your carbohydrates, it will start to strip protein from your muscles, which is awful because that's our main metabolic fuel that keeps our metabolism up. And it actually is a big risk factor for osteoporosis because calcium makes bones rigid, but it's the bony matrix, it's the protein matrix within the bone that makes them strong. So having lots of calcium, but having a poor blood sugar profile and high leptin will put you still at risk for you'll have very rigid, snappable bones. Okay? But you're not going to have strong tensile strength in the bones. By managing leptin levels and stabilizing blood sugar really well, that's one of the best things you could do to prevent osteoporosis. Question? No? Okay. Good fats. These are some of my favorite ones. Coconut oils. MCT oils are also called medium-chain triglycerides. They're a part of coconut oil, but you can get them in more specific fractions. MCT oils are really cool because they are a medium-chain fat, and they function differently than a lot of other fats. They don't go through the whole course of digestion through the intestines and everything. They basically get turned into ketones very quickly and used as energy. So I have MCT oils every day. I sometimes just put a tablespoon of them in my tea or in a coffee or something like that, and I'll have that because it also is a great one for cutting down cravings. You incorporate MCT oils, and I can go pretty much all day now if I wanted to, fasting, and have that in the morning, and it doesn't even throw my energy off, my mood, anything. Grass-fed butter. So butter is bad. Don't go crazy with it, but get grass-fed butter. It just means go to a health food store and get butter that is from pastured cows. The reason is that you're eating what you ate. Okay? So if you're eating meat, if that cow ate a whole bunch of grains and created a whole bunch of inflammatory fats, now meat is not good for me. It's an inflammatory thing that's going to probably increase my risk of cardiovascular disease. If I'm eating healthy fats that were farm-raised, on a pasture, free-range, that type of thing, they will create anti-inflammatory omega-6s in much higher amounts, and now that can actually be a beneficial thing for me to have. So it's not as simple as meat's bad or meat's good. It totally depends on the type of animal that you're consuming if you eat meat. And that goes the same for pastured pork. That goes the same for chickens and hens and whatnot that should be free range. It totally depends on what they eat. If they eat bad stuff, they create bad stuff. If they eat good stuff, they will create beneficial stuff for us. And grass-fed butter has butyrate, which is actually one of the key fatty acids that helps to heal the gut lining, and it actually feeds the microbes, or it feeds the colon lining.
versus buying organics?
In general, it's a real mismatch. What I would generally do is, the best thing you could do would be actually call the manufacturer and ask them. I called one a while back because, like, to try and get grass-fed in Canada here,
It's hard.
you're not going to get it because they're pasture raised in the summer, but during the winter, most of the time, they probably eat a lot of hay, but they likely are going to be supplemented with some kind of grain. So I called one of them that said grass-fed meats because that's a big catch thing now, and you can charge probably 3 times as much for it. And I asked them, and they said, no, they are supplemented after with grains. And I was like, okay, thank you. Now,
Some of the butchers will tell you too, because I want to ask that, to buy grass-fed, you're not going to find the flavor as good.
well, it's true. My dad used to be a butcher. And so my dad goes, it's such crap. He goes, grass-fed. He goes, you couldn't give it away when I was a butcher. He goes, everybody wanted the marbled fat meat that tasted good. He goes, now they charge 3 times as much for it. And he goes, it's crazy. My dad just still eats whatever he wants to eat. But he suffered from it too.
Jason, sorry, just like, what is that MCT?
MCT stands for medium chain triglycerides. So what they are is they are really the fats that are found in coconut oil, but they're sort of extracted in more specific. There's 4 different ones, and there's really 2 that work better than the other 2. So it does get a little bit more specific with it, but you can buy an oil that says MCT oil, or my favorite one that I use, I like the one called Brain Octane because it uses the smallest MCT oil that turns into ketones the fastest. So for me, I do that probably a tablespoon twice a day in things, and I find it just keeps my energy even. I don't get cravings, my brain's turned on, my energy's good. But it works if you're doing it. You couldn't do that and then have a bowl of cereal though. Like you have to do it as a whole thing.
Would you use it in stir fry?
I don't cook with it, but I would drizzle it on after. Yeah. So if you're looking at cooking oils, so olive oil should be raw. You don't want to cook with olive oil, or at least if you do, it should be very low heat, because it will go bad. Your best cooking oil, avocado oil. I think its smoke point is in the 500s. So you could even almost not that I'm saying deep fry, but that if you were, that would be the oil I would probably use. Olive oil should be raw, drizzled on. I sometimes will cook with coconut oil and grass-fed butter, but not at super high heat. And those would be my 2 main baking oils. Otherwise, I have olive oil and stuff, or salad dressing. I eat avocado regularly, and we love having good quality nuts and seeds.
So what would be the ratio for like fats to carbs?
It's going to vary for people, so you have to kind of figure it out. And initially, when people first try to incorporate more fats and decrease more carbohydrates, the body's not fat adapted yet, meaning that you're going to you might have some struggles with energy and stuff at first because your body's craving to get it from carbohydrates and you're trying to train it to get it from fats.
Is it better to gradually do that?
Yeah. No, I jump into things kind of, and I like to see what my body does. So for me, I kind of was like, I love it, that makes sense, I'm going to just do it. And it worked fine for me. And that actually has probably been my favorite way. I've tried tons of different diets. And that's been sort of my favorite version so far. But I've seen other people too that do better with a little higher ratio of carbohydrates. This would say your fat content should probably be more like 50% to 70% for some people of your diet, calorie-wise. Lots of vegetables, because vegetables don't add up very fast, moderate amounts of protein, and generally lower amounts of carbohydrates. I find women often need a little bit more carbohydrates than men do. Okay, probably something hormonally that's related with that. But you have to play with it a little bit, and that's where you use the cravings, hunger, energy, weight. So stress shuts down fat burning. I'm not going to harp on this one too long, but for the most part, when we go into fight or flight mode, we trigger all of those same hormones. We raise cortisol, we raise insulin, we raise inflammation, we screw up our leptin resistance. That whole sort of cascade happens. But what I want people to think about is that probably the biggest trigger or the biggest stressor that we're having on a regular basis is our diet. Because every meal that we have will play a role in either creating inflammation or not creating inflammation, raising cortisol or not raising cortisol. And we do that all day long, right? So that also, see, that's a very biochemical reason for creating stress. So if you add that onto our mental emotional stressors that we have in the day, it's very easy to see why sometimes people are just totally overwhelmed with stuff. Fat burning shuts off our ability to go into burning, when we get stressed, we shut off our ability to burn fat. You have to remember, this is a survival state that our body thinks that we're in. Our body will always choose to use sugar as its primary fuel source above fat because it's immediate. It's a much faster way to get energy. And so when we are in fight or flight, technically we should be running away from a saber-toothed tiger or fighting in a battle of some sort. So at that point, our body wants to use carbohydrates to have immediate fast energy, right? But the problem is that nowadays, and back then when we were in fight or flight mode, usually meant we were then doing something to burn it off, right? Like we were running away from something or fighting. So we were needing it and we were burning it. Now we go through periods of fight or flight all day long based on how we think and feel and what we're eating, but we're not necessarily going and burning it all off. So we're not getting it down. So that's why we start to get higher blood sugars, higher insulin resistance, because we're not sort of burning this stuff off anymore. And when we're in fight or flight, the brain is sending the signal that says we want to use glucose because that's its primary source. We're in survival right now. So you shut off the machinery that wants you to burn fat, and that fat gets back in storage again. And this is why when people are chronically stressed and they cannot get rid of fat around the belly, because you are sort of trapping it there because the nervous system is not going to let you do it. Survival will always take precedent. So if you are in survival mode, it will shut down your ability to access fat as a fuel source. And this is why we do things like yoga, meditation, and don't trigger it all day long from what we're eating in our diet. And we also, high cortisol causes low serotonin, okay? And so when that happens, then we also start to feel crappy. We feel tired. We feel moody. And then we actually don't care too much what we eat, and then we usually eat the wrong things up here.
So actually, as a snack, we shouldn't eat too much fruits, right?
Yeah, fruits. And again, some people do better with them than others. To me, I think fruits are a very natural thing. It's not processed at all. Like I wouldn't do juices.
No.
Other than sometimes I think vegetable juicing can be beneficial in the right season. But also think, what would you be eating seasonally for where you're living? That also, I think, is an important thing to look at. But yeah, initially, I would take fruits on the lower side of things. Or I would try to get a period in the morning and save my fruits maybe for like dinner for dessert or something like that. So that you're getting a prolonged period of time of being in a fat burning zone before you go out of it a little bit.
That's interesting.
So the gut microbiome. This is fascinating. I don't know if you're aware of this, but when you actually look at the number of bacteria and different sort of bugs that we've got in us, 90% of the body's cells are microbes. They outnumber us 10 to 1. When we look at DNA, we, as a human, we have 23,000 human genes, but there's over 1 million bacterial genes inside of us. So they talk about this as being a second human genome because it doesn't just sit there benign. It is constantly interacting and communicating with the brain through different neurochemicals, and it actually controls in many ways the expression of our own genes. So depending on what the bugs that we have and the ratios of the different types of bacteria we've got, they are influencing how our body burns fat, how it feels hungry, how it manages appetite, and how it boosts or slows down our metabolism. All just the bugs. So some people would say that the bacteria have actually created a very sophisticated transport vehicle as a human being. We've become a very good vehicle for bacteria to move around the planet. When we break it down, 90% of the gut flora is made up of 2 different families of bacteria. So we're going to call them the F's and the B's. Okay? And what they found is that the ratio of these different types of bacteria in our gut have a profound impact on inflammation, which governs things like obesity, diabetes, coronary artery disease. And essentially what they found is that the higher the amount of firmicutes in relation to these ones called bacteroidetes is related to an increased inflammation. So when you have more of the F's and less of the B's, you're going to get more inflammation. And what's fascinating is that the firmicutes one, they do stuff. So depending on what we're eating, we actually influence the production of those or the production of the other ones. And so what these bugs do is firmicutes are experts at breaking down and extracting calories from what we eat. So if, say, you ate a 100-calorie meal, if you've got a lot of these guys, you're going to take out like 100 calories from that meal, and your body's now going to have to process that. If you have more of the bacteroidetes, they're not quite so good at that. So then you might be taking in maybe 70% of those calories, and the rest of it we're excreting out. So if you've got a lot of these, you're going to be managing a lot more calories in your body every day than if you have a lot more of the other bacteria. Does everybody follow that? They also interfere with the immune function and tend to create inflammation. So they set up all of that hormonal cascade that we talked about that goes along with inflammation. Rising cortisol levels, rising insulin levels, rising leptin levels, and all of those sort of issues that then shut down our ability to burn fat. Literally, when you have these guys, and if you're feeding them the foods that they like, which for the most part is a standard North American diet, when you're feeding them that type of food, they literally hijack your DNA into thinking that it needs to store calories and that you're always hungry. So you eat a certain meal, you're influencing the bugs that now are basically telling the body what it wants to do. You're not even in control anymore. You're being controlled by the bacteria in your gut. How crazy is that? I think that is absolutely fascinating. And there was a study in the Journal of Nature in 2006 that showed that obese individuals had 20% more F's and 90% less B's. They did a big study where they were looking at European descendants and African descendants. And they found that the African descendants had significantly more B's and less F's, and the European descendants had significantly more F's and less B's. And they had a tendency towards being more lean and more healthy, and being more overweight and more unhealthy. Directly related to the bacteria in their gut. So they've done some rat studies. I don't know if you've ever heard of these, but these are fascinating and a little bit kind of gross, but this is sort of what they've done. So they would look at, this is where this whole, has anybody heard of things called fecal transplants? So this is fascinating. So how this started originally was they would look at bacteria. They did twin studies where they took twins, humans, an overweight woman, twin, and a underweight or slender woman that were twins. They extracted the bacteria from the feces of the overweight twin, and they put it into one of the mice. And they extracted the feces from the slender twin, and they put it into another mouse. Gave them exactly the same diet. No difference. The one that had the higher amount of the F's ended up becoming obese, and the other one stayed slender. And they ate exactly the same diet. So when we try and come down to when people eat really, really well, and they're doing everything right and they're not losing weight, I generally think this is a big piece of what's probably going on. And so they've even done now, there is a researcher in Amsterdam who is doing fecal transplantation on type 2 diabetic patients. And he is finding some pretty interesting results on improving insulin sensitivity with some of these really bad type 2 diabetics. So when we think of gut microbes, they play an essential role in how we store fat, how we balance blood glucose, how we express genes related to our metabolism, and not to mention how many calories we actually pull from our food, and they also interact with all the hormones that make us feel hungry or full. So why do we get a poor microbiome? So a lot of this can start right from beginning. C-section babies do not go through the natural vaginal canal and where they get inoculated with the right bacteria right from day one. Now that doesn't mean that they are a lost cause if that doesn't happen, but it means I would do different things. There's even studies now that would say for C-section babies that generally are at a higher risk for different allergies and ear infections and different types of even autoimmune conditions down the road and stuff, primarily because of this epigenetic interaction with these gut bacteria. They're even doing things now where if you were a C-section, or if you were going to have a C-section, you would actually do a vaginal swab where you would smear the baby once the baby comes out of the C-section with the vaginal secretion so that they are actually getting kind of inoculated with the right flora again. Also, they find that breastfed versus bottle-fed is a big difference too. Bottle-fed babies have poor microbiome, have more Firmicutes, less Bacteroidetes. Typical North American diet, okay? Again, they did a really cool study too with this that was fascinating. They were looking at mice, and they did the same thing. They put the bacteria in them, the bacteria that was from the overweight individual and the bacteria from the slender individual. And then they fed them a North American diet. And what they found was that over time, the one that had the slender bacteria actually changed the ratios and ended up producing more of the bad bacteria. So by eating a typical North American diet, we are going to increase the bad bacteria that makes us hang on to weight. They did another cool study with CRP. CRP is called C-reactive protein. It's a marker for inflammation that we use when we do blood tests. They did a study on McDonald's, and they had a person go and have McDonald's, and then they checked them within a very short period of time after, and their CRP levels skyrocketed within one meal. So, and when that happens, that triggers inflammation. So when we think about food as being information, you think about every meal that we're having, what message are we sending our body? And then we have to kind of decide, do I want to send that message or do I not want to send that message? But things happen very quickly. Now you can offset that a little bit. They found that they could offset it by actually incorporating some fresh fruits with higher fiber. Fiber is a big one that can offset some of that. But for the most part, I would probably be incorporating the healthy foods and not do the things that are triggering inflammation so I can get ahead of the game. Sugar, fructose, artificial sweeteners, all things that feed the bad guys and not the good guys. For the most part, the stuff that feeds the bad microbes are pretty much your sugars, your refined carbohydrates, that type of thing. The stuff that feeds the good guys is creating an anti-inflammatory environment through beneficial fats and having higher amounts of fibers in pre-fiber foods. Or prebiotic foods, I should say. Don't have GMO foods or pesticides. And then a number of different medications, antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, antacids, stress. And the bottom one there we can't see is over-hygiene. Okay, one of the big things they find is that people that generally are more slender have a much more diverse bacterial microbiome. When people are more obese, they have a much more refined, limited microbiome with not as many species. And that happens in North America more because we don't let our kids eat sand the same way. We don't do all these sort of things. Where when you look at the microbiome from someone that lives more in, say, like Africa, it's completely different. Hugely diverse. And what they're finding is that is a huge part in how our immune system works. They think that's a big reason why North Americans have so many allergies now, because we don't have the right bacteria that are interacting and communicating with our immune system. Improving gut flora. So if you can, start at the beginning with natural delivery and breastfed babies. Increase dietary fiber. Almost everybody is low in fiber. Everybody. Everybody should be trying to increase fiber, and if they can, I would probably even incorporate a fiber supplement later on in the day if you're not getting it through your fruits and vegetables for the most part. Increase a good quality broad spectrum probiotic. In the right strains, that can be very beneficial too. With that, I would also do prebiotic foods. So prebiotic foods are things like artichoke, dandelion, garlic, onion, different fibers. And then I would also look at fermented foods, if I don't have that on there. Fermented foods, things like kimchi, sauerkraut. If you're totally okay with dairy, doing like a kefir, those things all start, they're the food that allows the good bacteria to propagate. So we're kind of feeding them what they need to create more of them. Lots of veggies and some low glycemic index fruit, and generally a low carb, higher good fat diet is generally a good diet for this. Everybody probably like this one. Some wine. Now, you would see different experts would tell you opposites around wine. I've read some where they said no wine because that bugs it. And I've read other ones where they said, yep, some wine can be beneficial. The reason is that wine, tea, and coffee and chocolate are very high in polyphenols. Polyphenols are a very specific antioxidant that has a lot of anti-inflammatory properties and can help out the body in a ton of different ways. So by incorporating some of these, that can fit very well. I think that fits well if we're doing this. This is just going to add sometimes problems if we're not doing it. Best starting diet, high good fats, lots of vegetables, moderate clean proteins, lower carbohydrates, and then fine-tune with the chew. So you're always kind of then still accountable to change it so it works for you. And what works at one season might have to change at another season. You know, we are seasonal creatures. Food grows in different ways. And when we look at the microbiome, the bacteria in the soil, there's an interrelationship between us and our soil. And so when we eat local, some experts would say that there's actually a larger scale communication that is going on with the soil and with the gut bacteria in our body. And so when we eat locally grown soil, we are getting information from that bacteria to talk to the bacteria in our gut. When we are eating stuff that's coming from China or somewhere else, from a totally different flora that is not indigenous to us, sometimes there could be different messages. This is something that they need to do a lot more information around, but it makes a lot of sense to me. When you understand how much these bacteria communicate with our bodies, it's a completely symbiotic relationship. And to think that when we eat local, which I think is a really great thing to do anyways, that there's a bigger payoff with that. Not just helping local farmers and local industry, but we are communicating with our local bacteria. We are getting information and messages from that, okay? And what we get in the winter is going to be different than what we get in the spring and what we're going to get in the summer, depending on which kind of foods we're eating. And so a lot of experts would say, too, adjust it. I love this type of diet right now. I feel like that's warming for me, that's grounding, higher fats, it's winter time, it generally feels like being more of a kapha kind of a disposition. But in summertime, you know, generally you might be having more fruits at that time because it's more plentiful. I grew up in the Okanagan Valley. I ate tons of fruit in the summer. I mean, it's like, who wouldn't? You got cherry trees and peach trees and apple trees everywhere you look. So to me, that was just a part of what we did then. Once we kind of hit winter, it wasn't. It was more heavier foods like this. It was more crock pot, warming foods. It fit the environment, right? We usually do more cleansing foods around spring and fall because that fits the transition in the season. And if we're eating our local food, we're getting that other level of communication with the bacteria that are indigenous to our surroundings. So that covers everything I wanted to talk about for that. So thank you so much. And if anybody has any questions and we've got time, feel free to ask me anything you want.